Right, so as for the human skeleton system, so the human skeleton is part of the support system in humans. So in terms of helping to keep the human body in shape, the skeletal system actually is one such system that does that, because they are saying that it is a support system. It is a strong internal framework. So that simply means that the bones that make up the skeletal system, you cannot touch them externally, meaning literally touch them, because they are covered by the skin. And of course, some aspect of these bones, they are covered by the muscles. So that is why they are saying that it is an internal framework, or it is an internal structure. It has two major parts. So as for the entire human skeletal system, we can put it into two different main parts, namely the axial skeleton and of course the appendicular skeleton. So those are the two major parts of the human skeleton system. So good morning. So apart from saying that they are the two major parts, we can also refer to them as the two divisions of the skeleton system. So the axial skeleton and of course the appendicular skeleton. So in looking at the two divisions, we should be able to actually tell which bones or which part of the human skeletal system fall under each. So as for the axial skeleton, they are saying that this include the ribs, the sternum, the spine, and the skull. Now going back to the diagram there, as for the ribs, so by now persons should know the ribs. So these are the ribs. The sternum is that middle bone there that is known as the breastbone. So the sternum is otherwise known as the breastbone. And they are saying that the skull is also a part of the axial skeleton. And of course, the spine, or if you want to say the backbone. So this is actually the spine there, running from the base of the hip going right up onto the base of the neck region right there. Then of course the appendicular skeleton include the upper limbs. So the upper limbs meaning your arms, the lower limbs, and the lower limbs include meaning that those are your legs, your hip, and of course your shoulder girdle. So let's go back to the diagram and see if we can identify those parts. So of course that is the hip there, and the shoulder girdle is actually that entire section that go right across below your neck. That is what is known as your shoulder girdle. So those are what make up the appendicular skeleton. So as for question related to this concept, definitely I can ask you to list or state the parts that make up the axial skeleton, and the same thing goes for appendicular skeleton. So it is a must that persons be cognizant of the fact that we have two divisions of the entire of the human skeletal system itself, and within those two divisions we should know of course their names and the different parts that make them up. So please ensure that you study so that you can recall those for question and answer test purpose. Now moving on to another concept, the functions of the human skeleton system. So of course there are several functions that the human skeletal system perform. So in terms of you knowing this concept, one, you should be able to list the functions, and of course you should be able to offer some amount of description. So on the screen we're looking at the first function there, which is protection. Support, that's the next function of the human skeleton system. It also allow movement. It also produce blood cells. It provide a framework. It store minerals, and it assists in breathing. So all of those are the functions of the human skeleton system. So what we're going to do now, we're going to go into those functions individually, so we can definitely know in detail how the skeletal system basically work in carrying out its roles and of course functions. So as for protection, we're going to be looking at some examples of body parts that offer protection and the definite body parts that those section protect. So the skull and the rib cage have a protective function, for example. So the skull protect the brain, and of course your rib cage protect organs such as your heart, your lungs, your kidneys. So looking at the diagram here, as you can see the skull there, and definitely by now person should know that that is where your brain is located, within the space that is created by the skull, which is known as the cranium. And of course your rib cage is, it actually creates a space that is called a thoracic cavity, and that's where your heart, your lungs, your digestive system, your kidneys, all of those organs located within that section. So the rib cage offer protection also. So definitely person should be able to give me examples of protection in terms of the body part that offer the protection and the body part that get the protection from those. So the second point is saying that the skull protects the brain and the rib cage protects the lungs and the heart. So those are just two examples of the human skeleton system carrying out that role of protection. Pointer 3 also giving you another example where they are saying that the vertebral column protects the spinal cord. So what is the vertebral column? So the vertebral column is what is also known as the backbone. And again, you can see it there on the diagram. So the backbone around the back there, running from the top of the hip there to the base of your neck right there. So that is what is known as the backbone or the vertebral column. So inside of that vertebral column is a very important part of your nervous system that is known as the spinal, between your nervous system and of course those lower body parts. So in terms of protection, you definitely have enough examples to give me whenever you're being asked to give the human skeleton system. Support, that's the next function. So this is the second function of the skeleton system that we're looking at. So as for support, they are saying that the vertebral column, which is the backbone, and girdles mainly provide support. So those two parts definitely provide some amount of support. The vertebral column, that's the second pointer, support the body and head, while the girdles support the good morning, while the girdles support the bones in the limbs. So support meaning that it helps to keep those body parts. Yes, Anderson, I see you raising a hand. Repeat. Record? No, I put it on YouTube. I don't record the meeting in Google Classroom. I actually put the link on YouTube. So if you want to rewatch it, the link is in your group. The link is actually in the the link is in the WhatsApp group. So you click the YouTube link. I don't record it on Google Classroom itself. Yes. And when I go on the Google Classroom platform where the notes is, the link is there. You just simple click the link and it will start to play the YouTube video automatically. Alright. So those are the main reason why I do that is that, I mean, the ministry can just go ahead and just stop using Google Classroom. Once that is done, then I'm not gonna have access to those videos anymore. But when I put it on YouTube, it's on YouTube forever. So that's why I don't use the Google Classroom record. Actually, record it and put it on YouTube. Alright, so that's it for support. So if you're being asked to give or state list examples of the human skeletal system, then you just list them like that. Support would be one, protection number two, and that's it. But if you're asked to give explanation, then that is when you will actually go into detail and say, as for protection, for example, the skull protect the brain or the rib cage protect the lungs and the heart. Moving on to the third function, we have movement slash locomotion. Now, the reason why I have movement slash locomotion is that there's a slight difference between movement and locomotion. Movement is whenever you're just moving just a part of the human body. For example, you're just moving your arms, you're just moving your legs, you're just moving your fingers, you turn your neck. Those are examples of movement. Now, locomotion is when the entire body is moving, when the entire body is in motion. So that is locomotion. So the human skeletal system is what allow you to move, and it is what allow locomotion to take place. So if you're moving from point A to point B, that is locomotion. If you're just moving your arms, that is movement. So those are also functions of the human skeletal system. Production of blood cells. So of course the human skeletal system produce blood cells. So they are saying that the red bone marrow, which is normally inside large bones, produce blood cells such as your red blood cells, white blood cells, and of course platelets. I'm gonna bring up a picture of. Alright, so here we have an example of a long bone. So in the middle of the bone, there's a section that is called the bone marrow. For those persons who eat chicken, when you crack the chicken leg, I'm sure that sometimes you will see a lot of things in there. If it is not fried or cooked properly, then you actually will literally see blood. And that is simple because that's where red blood cells are produced. That's where white blood cells are produced. And that's where another blood cell that is known as platelets are produced. So that's what they mean when they said that the skeletal system, one of its function is that it produces blood cells. So as to where exactly within the skeletal system it is produced, that is actually in the bone marrow itself. So that's another function and the list of functions that you would have completed. So we look at protection, support, and of course we are now looking at production of blood cells. Provide a framework, also known as giving the human body shape. So definitely this is another function. So provide a framework. So in terms of giving the human body shape, it is the skeletal system that help to do that. In terms of shape, now the female skeletal system shape differently, slightly, from the male skeletal system. So the hip region of the female skeletal system normally wider, while the chest region for the male skeletal system normally wider, and that is why female have a tendency of having broader hips and male have a tendency of having broader shoulder, and that is simply because the skeletal system is different in these areas. storage of minerals. So this is another function of the human skeletal system. Definitely it help in storing minerals. So for example, you consume some calcium, some phosphorus. Now the human body might not be able to use all of these minerals at this all at once, so the human body need to store them somewhere inside the body, and the skeletal system would basically come to the rescue, meaning that the skeletal system is what will allow the human body to store those excess nutrients in terms of minerals that you would have consumed and your body don't need it within that specified time. So again, in terms of the functions, most time you're just required, you're just asked to list them. So in terms of the explanation, giving examples, I mean it's not common for CXC to ask questions. Let's say for example, give example of protection. But once you're able to list them, at least you should be able to give some example or give an example in terms of one of the function. The last function is assistance in breathing. So definitely the skeletal system assists when the diaphragm muscles contract and push the diaphragm up and outwards to expand the rib cage. This may more air enter the lungs. Alright, so whenever you're breathing in, persons can look at the chest region, and you realize that once you take a deep breath and you're breathing in, the chest normally go upward and then it go outward. Now that movement is as a result of your rib cage doing all of that movement, and which of course your rib cage is a part of your skeleton system. Now the reason why the rib cage go up and out is to make more space for your lungs, because remember that you're breathing in just like an inflated balloon. Once you're blowing air into the balloon, you can't hold on to the balloon firm. You have to hold the balloon with some form of relaxation, and because the air that you're entering in the balloon gonna actually expand or make the balloon larger in terms of size. So same thing with your lungs. Once you're breathing in, then definitely the lungs going to increase in terms of size. And the fact that the lungs going to increase in terms of size simply mean that it's going to need more space. So that is why the rib cage need to go upward and then it go outward. Once it do that, then more space is left for the lungs to be occupied. So that is how the skeletal system assists in breathing in terms of the breathing process. So that should cover the functions of the skeletal system. So now we have a new concept, new heading to look at, and this is known as the tissues of the human skeleton. So the different tissues that make up the human skeletal system, and we have tissues such as cartilage, we have bones, we have ligaments, we have tendons. So those are the tissues that we're definitely going to go through. So bones, and of course persons by now should know that yes, as for the human skeleton, there are a lot of bones. So we said that a mature human being basically have approximately 206 bones that make up the skeletal system itself. The first point is saying that bone is a living hard connective tissue. So there is normally a debate whether bones are living, yes or no, and the answer is yes. Bones are considered to be living tissues, and we have several justifications. One reason is simple, due to the fact that bones can grow. Because if you're born as a newborn at that, tiny, small structure in terms of human being, Then at this age now, the fact that you're larger, you're taller, simply mean that your bones, I mean, they have the capability of growing. So that's the only way you would increase in size. So the mere fact that bones can grow simply mean that yes, they are living. And next reason why we can say that bones are living is due to the fact that they actually produce or they manufacture um, blood cells. As if something is not living, then there is no way it can reproduce or produce something. Now, as to what they are made up of, they said that they are made up of from ground substance called matrix and bone cells. So those are just some smaller components. It also contains calcium phosphate and calcium carbonate. So if I should ask you to tell me some things that make up bones in terms of their structural arrangement, then you can give me those examples. So bone is a living tissue, and long bones are not solid. So some bones in the human body, they are solid, meaning that there are no bone marrow. For example, a type of bone that is known as flat bones. Flat bone. Now that bone, there is no hollow section in the middle, meaning that there is no bone marrows. But as for long bones, they are definitely tubular, meaning that they have a inner section there. Now the outer section of the bone, it is compact, and compact meaning that it is solid, and there's a reason why the outer section of the bone need to be compact, and that is simply because the bone marrow inside the middle where blood cells are produced, those they are really sensitive, because in the bone marrow you have things like blood vessels, you have nerves in there, so those are sensitive. So due to the fact that those are sensitive simply mean that they're gonna need some amount of protection surrounding them. So that's where the compact bone come into play. An inner layer of spongy bone and a central marrow cavity. Now to the end of bones, yes, I'm gonna use the chicken leg again. You will realize that the end section of the chicken leg, the bones, they are really spongy, and that is simple because they are called spongy bone. In terms of bones growing, they normally grow from the ends. So it is easier for the spongy bone to grow than the compact section of the bone. So that's why the ends of bones normally spongy. Ends long bone, they are tubular. So again, tubular mean that there's a inner section, there's a inner middle section there, and that's where the bone marrow falls. Red bone marrow is where red and white blood cells are produced. Would have already explained that concept. Now the second to last point is saying the end of bones are covered with cartilage, and of course cartilage is an next tissue of the human skeletal system that we'll be looking at. So the end of the bones, they are covered with cartilage simply because bones normally form what is known as joints, and more than one bones you will find at a joint. Either you're going to have 2 bones or 3 bones. It all depends on the type of joints. Now, in order for movement to happen at those joints, for example, your elbow joint, 3 bones actually form that joint. You have the radius, you have the ulna, and we have what is known as the humerus. Now, those 3 bones, those 3 bones are the elbow joint there. The fact that they normally move simple mean that for at some point they will actually rub against each other. So the fact that they are rubbing against each other mean that friction can develop. So to reduce the friction, the ends of bones normally covered with cartilage. So cartilage is connective. So the fact that the cartilage is connective, it is slippery. So the fact that it is slippery allow it to actually reduce the friction there, because friction definitely need to reduce, because if the friction is not reduced, then that can damage the end of the bone. And tendons, that's an next connective tissue, attach muscles to bone. So at the particular joint there, that is what is needed to attach the muscle to the bone. So that will sum up it for bone in terms of it being a tissue of the human skeletal system. So the second tissue of the human skeletal is known as ligaments. So ligaments, another tissue that we need to look at. So it is a form of connective tissue, and ligament normally join bone to bone. Now the example they are showing you is at the knee joint there, for example now. So you will realize that the knee joint, you have the upper femur, that's the large bones of your thigh. It will now go down and meet fibula and the tibula. Those are two bones of the lower legs. Down those bones, they don't just sit in place like that. Something need to keep them in place, and that's where the ligament come into play. So in order for bones to stay in place at a particular joint, then definitely something is needed to keep them in place, and that's where the ligament come into play. It is just like a door on your house. You don't just put the door at the door jam and it just automatically stay there. No, you have to have the inches and the screws that actually attach the door to the door jam. So it is the same thing with the ligaments and the bones at a particular joint. Something need to keep the bones in place, and that's where the ligament come into play. So they are saying that as for ligaments, as yellow elastin fibers, which make them elastic but tough. So that simply means that they can stretch somewhat. So the fact that they allow movement, they allow the bones to move, they should be able to stretch, because they can't just rigid like that. Then if they are just rigid, meaning that they are stiff, they don't allow any flexibility, then definitely it will not allow movement to take place at the joint, which of course it is meant for.